The sound of a chair leg snapping under dead weight is something you don't forget. After 35 years in construction, I've heard that sound on scaffolding and in half-finished buildings, and every time it's followed by one terrible second of silence before someone starts yelling. When my daughter-in-law went down at my retirement dinner, chair and all, that second of silence was the most satisfying moment of my 64 years on this earth. But to understand why I stood there and let it happen, you need to go back 3 hours earlier, to the moment I found her crouched under the head table with a hex wrench in her hand. Before I go any further, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. And if you've ever had to protect someone you love from the people who were supposed to love them most, hit that like button and subscribe. Because this one is for every parent who ever got mistaken for an ATM. I arrived at the Whitmore Club at 4:15 in the afternoon. The dinner didn't start until 7. That's a habit I never shook from the job site. You walk the floor before the crew arrives. You check the load-bearing walls before you start swinging hammers. My wife, Diane, was still at the hotel getting dressed. She'd insisted on wearing heels despite what the physical therapist had said about her knee replacement, and I'd known better than to argue. She wanted to look strong. After 6 months of recovery, she needed that night. The banquet manager, a compact man named Mr. Dempsey, showed me to the private dining room where the retirement dinner was being held. 110 people were coming. My partners, my foreman, clients who'd been with me for 2 decades. Dempsey told me the floral arrangements weren't quite finished and offered to come back in 20 minutes. I told him I was fine on my own. I wanted to check the table settings. Old habit. The room was dim, the overhead fixtures on a half setting, while the staff finished the final prep. I walked to the head table slowly, my eyes adjusting to the light. I was thinking about the centerpiece. Diane had requested white roses, and I wanted to make sure they'd gotten the color right. When I noticed something off near the far end of the table, there was a sound. It was quiet, a small metallic clicking, the kind of sound a socket makes when you're working a tight bolt in a confined space. I know that sound the way some men know birdsong. I stopped. She was crouching behind the head table, half hidden by the floor-length linen, working something near the base of a chair. It took me a moment to recognize her, my daughter-in-law Tara, because I wasn't expecting her. She'd told Diane she was coming at 6:30. What I didn't expect was the compact multi-tool folded out in her right hand, or the way her head turned every few seconds toward the main doors to make sure she was alone. She didn't see me. I was still in the shadow of the service entrance, and she was focused on her work, with the concentration of someone who doesn't want to be interrupted. The chair she was working on was the one at the far right of the head table, the seat of honor chair, the one with the name card that read Guest of Honor, Diane. I didn't move. I pressed myself back into the shadow of the entrance column and I watched. Tara worked 2 bolts on the front right leg, loosening them, not removing them, just backing them off enough that the leg would hold under the static weight of someone sitting, but give way under the lateral torque of someone pushing themselves to a standing position. I know exactly what that does to a joint assembly because I've seen it happen with improperly secured scaffolding. The leg doesn't snap all at once. It twists, the seat tilts, the person sitting goes sideways without warning. If Diane stood up too quickly, which she would, because she always stood quickly out of nervousness, she would go down, on a knee that was 8 months out from surgery, on a knee whose surgeon had looked me in the eye and said, if that joint takes a hard impact in the next 18 months, we are looking at a revision surgery, and at her age, the recovery from a revision is not guaranteed. Tara knew that. She'd been in the room when the surgeon said it. She'd nodded and typed something on her phone. Then she stood up, examined the chair with the satisfaction of someone who'd done a clean job, and walked to the other end of the table. She pulled out her phone. I heard her talking in a low voice, and because the acoustic tile in that room channels sound like a cathedral, I heard every word. It's done, she said. She'll hold still for dinner, but the minute she tries to get up for that toast, yeah, I know. At this point, if she spends a few weeks in a rehab facility, maybe your father finally stops pretending everything is fine and signs over the partnership. We're not waiting another 2 years, Liam. We've been patient long enough. She laughed at something my son said on the other end. Just make sure you sit her down in that chair and keep her there until the speeches. I'll handle the rest. She hung up and walked out through the side exit, her heels clicking on the parquet. I stood in the shadow for a long moment. I am 64 years old. I spent my career calculating structural loads and tolerances. I am not a man who reacts without thinking, but in that moment the thing I felt in my chest was not anger. It was something colder. It was the feeling I get when I look at a building and I just know, that the foundation is rotten. That it doesn't matter how beautiful the exterior is. The whole thing is coming down. I walked to the parking lot. In the back of my truck I keep a small tool roll. Always have. Old contractors never stop carrying their tools. I found my hex key set in under 30 seconds. I walked back to the dining room. Mr. Dempsey was still in the corridor with his clipboard. I told him I wanted to check the chair spacing for my wife's mobility, and he smiled and waved me in. I went straight to Diane's chair. I tightened those bolts down harder than they'd ever been. I checked all 4 legs. I tested the seat joint with my full body weight. It was solid as bedrock. Then I looked at the chair to the left of Diane's, the one with the place card that read Tara, guest. I gave the front right leg 2 full turns counterclockwise. Then I sat down in my own chair at the center of the table, and I ordered a glass of water from the young server who came in to fill the pitchers, and I waited. By 5 o'clock, I'd texted my attorney, Graham, who'd handled my business affairs for 18 years. Hold the trust amendment filing scheduled for Monday. Don't execute anything until you hear from me. By 5:15, I'd texted my financial advisor, flagged the joint investment transfer, put a hold on it. By 5:30, I'd called my real estate agent and told her to relist the lake house I'd been planning to hand over to my son as an anniversary gift. She sounded confused. I told her I'd explain later. Then I put my phone in my breast pocket and went to meet my wife. Diane was wearing a dark green dress that she'd bought 2 months ago and been nervous about ever since. She looked beautiful. She always looks beautiful. 41 years of marriage, and I still mean that without thinking about it. Do I look all right? She asked me. You look like the woman I married, I said. She squeezed my arm and we walked into the Whitmore Club together. For a moment, just a moment, I let myself feel sad. Not for what I was about to do, for the fact that it needed to be done at all, for the fact that the boy I had raised, the boy I'd taught to read a level and pour a foundation, had heard his wife's plan and said yeah. But sadness is not a useful material. You use it when you need to, then you put it away. The guests arrived at 7. My old foreman came through the door first, wearing a suit that probably hadn't seen daylight since his daughter's wedding. Half of my former crew showed up in their best clothes, looking like they were attending a state dinner. I shook 100 hands and I smiled at 100 people, and I looked for my son across the room. Liam was at the bar. He was already on his second drink, which was unusual for him. He looked nervous. He looked like a man who knows something is coming and is steeling himself for the noise. My daughter-in-law was beside him, radiant in a cream-colored cocktail dress, working the room. She moved through those 100 people the way a shark moves through water, smooth and efficient and always oriented toward whoever mattered most. I watched her air kiss my old business partner's wife. I watched her laugh at a joke my insurance broker made. I watched her clock every person's watch and every woman's jewelry. Then I watched her eyes find Diane. It lasted half a second, that flicker, the way her expression recalibrated, and then the mask came back and she floated toward us with her arms open. Mom, she said, pulling Diane into a hug that lasted exactly as long as it needed to for the photographer hovering 3 feet to the left. She held Diane at arm's length, tilting her head. You look exhausted, sweetheart. Are you feeling okay? You really didn't have to come if it's too much. Diane laughed. Too much? I've been looking forward to this for months. Tara's smile didn't waver. Of course you have. I just worry about you. She lowered her voice to the pitch of private concern, the kind that only the two of them and I could hear. I told Liam we should have had the dinner at the house, something smaller. But you know how men are. They don't think about these things. She touched Diane's arm. Just let me know if you need to sit down and I'll get you set up right away. We don't want you overdoing it and having a setback. Diane nodded. I watched the warmth go out of her eyes the way a light goes off in a window. Thank you, honey, Diane said. I said nothing. I put my hand on the small of Diane's back and steered us toward the table. Here's the thing about my daughter-in-law that people who don't know her never see. She's surgical. She doesn't attack. She erodes. Over the course of that dinner, which ran from 7 to 9, I watched her work on Diane with the patience of water wearing through stone. When the appetizers came out, a shrimp bisque that Diane had specifically requested because it was her favorite, Tara leaned over and said quietly, "Mom, are you sure about this? Shellfish is so inflammatory. After what your doctor said about managing swelling around the joint, I don't want to see you suffer tomorrow." Diane set down her spoon. When the bread basket arrived, Tara sighed. "Carbohydrates are really the enemy when you're in recovery. I read a whole article about it. It's not about calories, it's about the systemic inflammation cycle." Diane didn't touch the bread. When the main course came, a fillet of beef that Diane had been looking forward to all week, Tara looked at Diane's plate and said nothing. She just glanced at her own salad, then back at the fillet, and made the smallest possible sound in the back of her throat. The sound a person makes when they decide, generously, not to say something they're thinking. Diane ate 3 bites and put her fork down. I ate my dinner. I ate every bite. My hand was steady. My pulse was slow. Under the table, my phone vibrated twice. Confirmations from Graham and from the financial advisor. Everything on hold, every transfer, every carefully planned act of generosity that I had been building toward for 4 years. Each vibration felt like a door closing on a room I no longer needed to enter. Liam sat 2 seats down from me and said almost nothing for the first hour. He laughed at the right moments during the table conversation. He refilled people's wine. He was performing the role of the dutiful son at his father's retirement dinner with the convincing thoroughness of someone who has rehearsed. Every so often he looked at his wife and she gave him the smallest nod. At 8:45, Mr. Dempsey appeared at the doorway and gave me the signal we'd arranged, time for the speeches. The room quieted. My old business partner stood up and said some things that made people laugh and some things that made them tear up, and then he sat down and it was time for the champagne toast. I stood up first and said a few words about 35 years of work, about the men and women who'd built things that would stand long after all of us were gone, about what it means to put your hands to something real. I thanked Diane. I didn't look at Liam when I said her name. Then the room raised their glasses, and I raised mine, and I turned and looked at my daughter-in-law. She was already rising. She put her hands flat on the table. She pushed herself up the way a person does when they want to look graceful, shifting her weight forward, lifting her chin for the room. Her cream-colored dress was perfect. Her smile was perfect. She was the picture of a young woman on her way up in the world. The chair tilted. It wasn't a sudden collapse. It was subtle enough that for 1/2 second she thought she'd simply lost her balance. Her smile flickered. She adjusted her weight. The chair tilted further, the front right leg rotating on its loosened assembly, and my daughter-in-law went sideways. She grabbed for the tablecloth. The tablecloth did not hold. What followed happened in a sequence that I watched the way I watch a controlled demolition, everything falling in exactly the order it was always going to fall. Her arm swept across the table. 2 champagne flutes went over. The small flower arrangement at the corner tipped. A candle in a glass votive fell with her, and the votive shattered on the edge of the chair as she went down, and somewhere in the landing the side seam of her cream-colored cocktail dress gave way with a sound sharp enough to hear across the room. She hit the floor amid broken glass and spilled champagne and scattered white rose petals. The room went silent. Not the polite silence of a formal dinner, the deep, bottomless silence of 110 people processing something they have never seen before. I did not move. I stood at the head of the table with my champagne glass still raised, and I watched my daughter-in-law sit in the wreckage of her own plan. Then I heard my son's voice. He'd been 5 feet away. He'd watched the whole thing happen, and his first instinct was to look at his mother. "Mom," Liam said, his voice tight and accusatory, "what did you do?" Diane looked at him with an expression I hadn't seen on her face since he was a teenager and had done something that broke her heart. Pure bewilderment, pure hurt. "What?" she whispered. "Don't play innocent." My daughter-in-law was already pulling herself up from the floor, her dress torn at the hip, her composure in ruins, and her voice had shed every layer of performance like a snake shedding skin. "You did something to that chair. I know you did." She pointed at Diane, her hand trembling. "You've never wanted us to be happy. You've never wanted this marriage to work. You did something to that chair so I would fall." "Tara," I said. My voice was quiet, not raised, not angry. It was the voice I use when I tell a crew to stop work and back away from a structure that is no longer safe. The room heard it. My daughter-in-law heard it. She stopped. "Sit down," I said. Don't tell me to. Sit down. Something in my voice made her comply. She sat in the nearest undamaged chair, her torn dress bunched around her, her champagne-wet hair sticking to her cheek. I looked at my son. Did you know? I asked. He opened his mouth. Before you answer, I said, understand that I was in this room at 4:15 this afternoon. I watched your wife work the bolt on that chair with a hex key, and I heard what she said to you on the phone when she was done. I paused. So before you answer me in front of these people, I want you to think carefully about which version of the truth you want on record. Liam's face did something complicated and then went very still. The room was so quiet I could hear the ice melting in the water glasses. My son said nothing, and in saying nothing, he said everything. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. I opened the text thread between Liam and Tara that I'd seen 3 weeks ago when my son had handed me his phone to show me a photo and accidentally opened the wrong conversation. I'd said nothing at the time. I'd filed it away the way you file away a structural report that tells you what you already suspected. I read 2 messages aloud. I won't repeat them here in full, but one of them said that as soon as I signed the partnership papers, they would start the process of moving Diane into managed care, and the other said that the retirement dinner was the right moment because if something happened there in front of everyone, it would be easier to make the case. I put the phone back in my pocket. Your mother, I said to my son, had her knee replaced 8 months ago. Her surgeon told us that a hard fall in the next 18 months could mean a revision surgery she might not fully recover from. You were standing right beside me when he said it. I let that sit for a moment. Your wife knew that. She used it. Liam looked at the floor. And you let her, I said. That's the part I keep coming back to. I turned to the room. These were my people. 35 years of shared work, shared trust. I'm sorry you had to see this tonight, I said. I want you to know that Diane is all right. I made sure she would be. I looked at Mr. Dempsey in the doorway. I think we're done for the evening. He nodded and moved toward the staff. I went to Diane. I put my hand on her shoulder and she reached up and covered my hand with hers. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. What happened in the next 10 minutes happened quietly, which was appropriate, because the quietest things are usually the most permanent. I told my son, just the 2 of us in the corridor outside the dining room, while Tara was being helped by a server who'd brought a linen to cover the tear in her dress, that the trust amendment was on hold indefinitely, that the investment transfer had been stopped, that the lake house was going back on the market Monday morning, that the partnership papers sitting on Graham's desk, ready for my signature, would not be signed. Liam stared at me. Dad. I know. We don't have. Our mortgage refinancing depends on the co-signing. I know, I said. You can't just. Liam. I looked at him, really looked at him. I looked for the boy who used to fall asleep in the truck on the way back from job sites, who once cried for 20 minutes because we found a bird with a broken wing in the driveway. I would have given you everything. I had it planned to the last detail, the business, the house, the accounts. I stayed in this company 10 years past when I wanted to retire because I wanted to hand you something real. I paused, but you have to be someone real to receive it. He looked away. Get your wife some help, I said. I mean that genuinely. Something is broken there, and it's not a chair bolt. I walked back into the dining room, collected Diane, and said our goodbyes. My old foreman hugged me at the door and didn't say anything, which was exactly right. My business partner shook my hand and said, You all right, George? And I told him my name wasn't George, and he laughed despite himself, and that was exactly right too. In the car, Diane was quiet for a long time. We were on the highway before she spoke. How long have you known? She asked. About tonight, since 4:15. She was quiet again, then about all of it. I thought about that. Long enough, I said. She nodded slowly. She looked out the passenger window at the highway lights, and then she said something I've thought about every single day since. I kept thinking that if I was just patient enough, she said, if I gave her more grace, more time, I thought maybe she was afraid of me, and that if I made myself small enough, she'd stop being afraid. She shook her head, but she wasn't afraid of me, she just didn't respect me. And I kept trying to earn the respect of someone who'd already decided I wasn't worth it. I reached over and took her hand. Pain isn't the price of admission into someone's family, I said. It never should have been. She held my hand and didn't let go for a long time. We didn't go home that night. Home felt too large, too full of plans that had been made for other people. I asked Diane if she'd ever been to Asheville, North Carolina. She said she hadn't but had always wanted to go. I said the Blue Ridge Mountains were supposed to be something in October. She said October was 2 weeks away. I said close enough. We drove until we found a good hotel with a restaurant still open, and we ate real food without anyone monitoring our plates. Diane ordered the pasta and ate every bite. I ordered a slice of chocolate cake for no reason except that I wanted it. We laughed about something small that I can't even remember now, and it felt like the first clean breath I'd taken in a year. The partnership papers were never signed. The lake house sold in March for more than I'd been planning to give it away for. The trust was restructured, and the primary beneficiaries now are an affordable housing nonprofit that builds homes for veterans, and the local library where Diane volunteered for 9 years before her knee went bad. I heard from my son twice in the months that followed, once to tell me I'd overreacted, once to tell me he and Tara were going through a rough patch and could we talk. I told him I was always willing to talk, but there was nothing to renegotiate. He said I was being cruel. I told him that withholding the truth from someone is cruelty. Protecting yourself from a lie is something else entirely. I haven't heard from him since. I won't pretend that doesn't cost something. It costs a great deal. But here is what I know after 64 years. You cannot build a solid structure on a compromised foundation. You can decorate it. You can light it up so it looks beautiful from the outside. But eventually, the weight of everything sitting on top of it will find the weakness, and when it goes fast. I spent my career building things meant to last. I am not going to stop now. What would you have done in my position? Would you have spoken up earlier, or would you have waited and let it play out the way it needed to? Tell me in the comments. And if you believe that protecting the people you love, even when it's hard, even when it costs you something you spent your whole life building, is what it really means to be a man, hit that like button and subscribe. Some things in this life are worth building, and some things you have to be willing to let fall.